Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about Zeri's visual design, kind of the controversies that have been being discussed over on Twitter about Zeri's visual design, and where I kind of think this discussion ultimately is going to lead us to. Now, I'm aware I'm not normally a visual design kind of guy. I usually leave that to other folks to do, so I tend to focus more on the sort of mechanical design of things, but I did kind of want to give my 2 cents on this subject, because I fundamentally don't think that Zeri's visual design is bad. Despite all the conversation that's been happening, despite everyone kind of saying Zeri doesn't work for me and Zeri just has a bad design, because I really don't think so, right? Some of the complaints talk about how Zeri has a similar personality to other recent female champions that were released. She's very bright and optimistic and cheerful, like Zoe, Lilia, Yumi, and most recently Gwen. I do feel like we don't quite know this yet. We haven't seen the character in game. We don't have any sense of her voice lines, so I don't know that I necessarily agree with this. But I think the biggest thing is that people are really not happy with Zeri's design. They feel like she's uninteresting, and they feel like she's another character that Riot have sacrificed a lot of the interest that they could have done with her design in favor of making her more relatable and more marketable and more generally attractive. And I don't think this is the case at all. I feel like, for example, if you'd have released Zeri back in Season 3, Season 4, when we were regularly getting champions like Lissandra or Aatrox or Zac, I don't think there would have actually been a problem with Zeri literally at all. I think really the problem, and this is actually a conversation that's cropped up, I think, almost every time Riot have released a champion that looks like they're intended to be attractive, right? There was a similar conversation about Viego when he released. There was a similar conversation about Gwen when they released. And this is sort of regardless of the merits of these characters' designs, right? Viego and Gwen actually, I think, have very strong designs that tell a story and serve the character quite well, and I do feel like Zeri is going to be in a very similar spot, but I think that the reason people are getting so worked up over what essentially amounts to nothing is due to burnout. I think at this point, the community is so sick of seeing stereotypically attractive or stereotypically marketable characters that they are done with seeing it regardless of the merits of these characters. And I don't think this is a hard concept to consider. It's no secret that in recent years, Riot has been releasing a lot of champions that are intended to be stereotypically attractive and marketable, oftentimes to the detriment of their design. Even looking back through the last couple of years, you have champions like Set, Viego, Gwen, Seraphine, Akshan, and regardless of whether or not the designs serve the character, it does feel a little ham-fisted that every single character coming out is someone that is intended to be sort of perfectly marketable. And even champions like Set, who initially people really liked, have sort of been dragged down retroactively due to this sort of constant bombardment of hot people, basically, into League of Legends, which is a game that has been known for basically anything being a champion. Even child mummies, or children that can summon bears and are pyromaniacs, or, you know, that guy from 300, right? Like League of Legends, anything can be a champion, and so but instead we've been sort of bombarded with a bunch of runway models that really have been sort of raising the question of, okay, why do we care, right? Like, when every single character is attractive, what happened to the sort of beauty and magic that initially League of Legends had? This is also compounded by the fact that Riot have been releasing large quantities of skins over the last 2 years that either pretty up champions that aren't particularly attractive on their own, or which transforms them entirely into a form that humans can find attractive. Debonair and Eternal Dragon Brand are both examples of Riot sort of sanding away the rough edges from Brand to make him more generally appealing. And in a similar fashion, Arcana Xerath, and now Porcelain Kindred, which is on PvE, is another way in which Riot are sort of transforming these characters that aren't really human. They have kind of sort of human morphology, but they aren't human, and Riot are saying, snap their fingers, boom, these characters are humans now because we want to be able to sell skins, we want to make them marketable. And so I think that Zeri is not a very egregious example, but when you've had so many of these characters released over the last few years, and so many of these skins released over the last few years, it ends up being a lot of anger and a lot of disappointment being directed at this particular champion because of all of the sort of, just because people are done, because people are burnt out, because people aren't interested anymore. And so while I don't want to entirely defend Zeri's design, I do think it could be pushed farther, but it's by far and away not the worst thing that Riot have ever released. And I think the biggest thing here is that Riot need to take steps to make their designs more interesting and engaging. And now this doesn't mean that they should stop releasing conventionally attractive characters or marketable characters, right? I understand that they need to make money. I understand that they need to release characters and skins that people want to buy and that people want to use. That's how they're in business. That's what you want to do. I get that. But I also think that there are steps that they can take to make this a more reasonable approach without burning out the community members with just sort of an onslaught of characters that are not interesting and engaging. In general. Obviously, this isn't going to touch on skins at all, but generally speaking, talking about their character releases. I think the first thing that Riot can do is to spread out the release of their sort of marketable champions. Instead of bombarding us with them over multiple releases every single year, maybe taking one champion off in sort of a half-see way, right? Vex, for example, I don't think really counts as a palate cleanser because Vex is a Yordle, and Yordles are basically just small furry humans, so that doesn't really work, I don't think, as a way for Riot to really spread things out. But if Riot instead release, let's say, a humanoid champion, and then a couple of their normal marketable fare, and then a monster champion, and then a couple more of their normal marketable fare, I think that sort of is a way to help prevent the community from getting as burnt out as they got, because then at the very least, we know that this isn't going to be the only character released this year, that we know that there are going to be more interesting designs coming, and that way we can be more interested overall in where the game is going. I think that humanoid champions are a great way to bridge the gap, as their general human morphology and relatability is balanced by some monstrous features, which helps sort of both camps come together over the design. And the occasional monster champion will be really great as a palate cleanser because it's just totally different, and so you really can get interested and excited about the details. And this way, when they do release one of their marketable champions, we're more likely to look at the new champion design with fresh eyes, instead of instantly hating it just because it's not interesting. It's just a human in interesting clothes, maybe. And that sort of leads me to my second point. I think Riot need to give their stereotypically attractive champions more interesting character designs. I think that part of the problem that we're having is that the marketable characters have such boring designs by comparison to characters that clearly weren't intended to be marketed, which is mostly to prevent them from being disliked, but it also means that they just end up being very bland. There's nothing about them that particularly stands out or makes them unique or interesting. They're just kind of there doing their thing, and the most interesting part about them is that, oh, look how attractive this character is, versus anything else going on with the design. This is what I like to call the Overwatch approach. You sand off anything that might possibly make the character less appealing, and thereby make them extremely bland and uninteresting, regardless of what the character's story is. So I don't think that you have to stop making hot champs, but at least make their designs interesting. I think a really good recent example of this, actually, is Yone. If you look at Yone, right, this is not an unattractive character. If you look at his chest, if you look at his abs, if you look at his arms, his long flowing hair, like, this is a character that was designed to be hot. But Yone didn't catch the same flack that a lot of these other characters did. And that's because Yone's visual design didn't really compromise and say, look how sexy Yone is. Yone's visual design still incorporates elements that make him look less human, that make him look sort of interesting and engaging, right? The Azakana mask, which really helps break up his facial silhouette and make him sort of look like, okay, is that a human? The flowing bandages, which is sort of a very ghostly effect that you're like, okay, he looks alive, but also what's up with the bandages, right? The double sword with the one red demon Azakana blade. There's enough about Yone's visual design where he is still a very marketable character, but it isn't as boring and uninteresting as it could have been. I really feel like a lot of Yone's skins have sort of sanded off some of those details, but the base Yone design, I think, is actually really good in that regard. And that's one of those things that I really feel like Riot could be doing with their stereotypically attractive champion designs, is finding ways to make the designs stand out and make them interesting and make them engaging, and you don't have to sacrifice this character looking less attractive, right? You don't need to go out of your way to make them ugly, but I think that you could at least say, this is the design we want to go for. We want to make sure that they're still attractive, but how can we do this in a way that still makes them interesting from a character perspective? Zeri, for example, I think that she could have had a more interesting, detailed jacket, maybe with some asymmetric elements in order to make it stand out. I think she could have had an undershirt that didn't look like it was sold at Hot Topic. Firelight Echo, I think, is a really good example of how to do this kind of look in a way that makes the character interesting, even though it's basically just a coat and an undershirt. If Zeri had goggles, that's breaking up her facial silhouette more. That way we feel less like Riot's keeping the face exposed because they want to say, look how attractive this character is. Or if she actually had a gun hand. That's an interesting bit of character design there that doesn't take away from Zeri being attractive, but does at least, it's an interesting character hook. I mean, I even speculated my first 5 minutes with the character. That was one of my speculation points was, is that a gun hand? Did Zeri lose a hand and replace it with a gun? Because that at least would be an interesting bit from a character design perspective that I could get behind. But of course that wasn't the case, right? Riot didn't want to sacrifice any of this character's potential marketability. And so I generally think that this would be a much better approach going forward, is to not sacrifice some of these ideas because they feel like if they do anything unique or interesting, that the character is going to be less attractive and therefore less marketable. I think that there's a lot of room for Riot to actually do this, so even if they choose to not make more humanoid or monster champions, which I think would be a big mistake, you guys all know my opinion on that, I think that this would be a much better way for them to at least compromise with us and say, okay, sure, we're still going to make a lot of marketable champions, but we're going to give them interesting visual silhouettes and interesting visual designs. So anyways, those are my 2 cents on Zeri's design. Let me know what you guys think of her down in the comment section below, especially if you're still not a fan or if you are actually a really big fan. I'd love to hear your thoughts on why you really like Zeri. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I plan to do every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all later.